Hello, best friends, and welcome back to our cozy little corner of the internet. I hope this video finds you super well and that you are having the best week of all freaking time because you deserve it. If you are new here and you have never seen this face before, then hello, my name is Liz and it is so lovely to meet you. And if you're into things like true crime and unsolved mysteries, then you should totally hit subscribe and you and me can be best friends forever. I mean, if not, that's fine. We can be chill. I can totally be chill. But just so you know, we're best friends now. Hey, Lil. You want to do Lily Cam here? Oh, it's Lily Cam here today. Hey? Are you going to keep us company today? Paul? Oh, you are the best girl of all time. So I have a little bit of an interesting one for you guys today. It's a little bit different for us because the case we're talking about, no one gets murdered, but don't get too comfortable because just because no one gets murdered does not make this case any less disturbing or intense than any case we would usually speak about. Trust me. Today we're talking about the very controversial, very crazy, insane tale of Mary Kay LeTourneau and Vili Fualaau. And if you're already familiar with these two people, then you and me both know that you don't need any warning from me whatsoever about what we're going to be talking about today. But if you are not familiar with Mary and Vili and you've never seen them before, don't recognize them at all, then you should probably brace yourself real hard right now. Okay? Right about now, there will be a disclaimer somewhere on the screen. And if while reading this disclaimer, you are like, this might not be the best case for me to hear about today, then I strongly urge you to please be kind to yourself and click away now. I will, of course, miss you like stage 5 clinger style until the next video, but I promise we'll be talking about just some, regular murder case in the next one. Not that murder is ever regular. I mean, it's a terrible thing, but it is what our friendship is based on. I don't know how I feel about that. So I remember hearing about this case in the 90s as a kid and being just mind blown to the point where I thought it wasn't true. I thought everyone was talking about some movie that I was too young to watch. Anyone that grew up in a semi-strict Christian household will probably relate to that happening at some point in your life. But imagine my surprise as a fully grown, semi-functioning adult when I found out that this case did actually happen. It's all true. So without further ado, if you guys have your snacks and your drinks on hand, let's dive on into this case. So we are going back in time today to a balmy summer night in June 1996 in Seattle, Washington, when the police came across a minivan parked in the Des Moines Marina parking lot at about 1:20 a.m. in the morning. To set the context and the mood a little, if you were to turn on your radio in June 1996, you might hear One Sweet Day by Mary Kay and Boyz II Men, maybe Give Me One Reason by Tracy Chapman, or if you were really lucky, the Macarena by Los Del Rio. And I know this because lately when I've been researching my cases, I've been listening to playlists on Spotify from that year. I guess it just gives me perspective. Like I sit there listening like, oh yeah, I remember what life was like at this time. So today I thought I would just share that and let you guys get some perspective as well. But moving on with the actual case, this minivan, I don't know if it had been reported to the police or they had randomly spotted it while they were driving past. But as they approached it, they knew what they were most likely going to be interrupting, right? I mean, it's a hot summer's night. It's parked in this secluded little parking lot by the water. It's all very romantic, if you're into that kind of thing. And sure enough, as they're walking up, they spot a blonde female jump up from the back seat and move into the front seat, and they see a dark-haired male laying down in the back seat as though he's asleep. Super well played, but the police weren't fooled. They knock on the window, and when the female grudgingly rolls it down, they're like, what are you crazy kids up to? And the woman acts all innocent, like she doesn't know what they're talking about. But when they ask her to get out of the car, they see that the only item of clothing that she has on is a t-shirt that comes down to her thighs. And meanwhile, they're looking at the male in the back seat, and he looks pretty young. Like there is quite an obvious age difference between the two, and they're clearly not related. But the woman assures them that the boy is 18 years old. He's a family friend that had been at her house that night, and he had freaked out and run off when her and her husband had had a fight. So she'd taken off after him and found him, and that's how they ended up where they were in this parking lot at 1:20 a.m. in the morning. But this story just isn't sitting well with police, though. They're feeling a little bit off about the whole thing. So they end up taking the pair down to the station, and there they ask the boy if anything risque was happening, and he says no. The woman also enthusiastically denies that anything along those lines was occurring. You know, she was just comforting him after this fight he had witnessed between her and her husband. Now, back at the car park, when police had asked them for identification, they had given false names, but eventually they caved, and she said she was Mary Kay LeTourneau and the boy was Vili Fualaau. And it turned out they had also lied about his age, because while Mary was 34 years old, Vili was only 13 years old. So police are asking themselves what exactly this 34-year-old woman is doing in a car park at 1 a.m. in just her t-shirt with a 13-year-old boy, right? So they call Vili's mother and they say, look, we've got Vili. He's been hanging out with this woman named Mary Kay LeTourneau. And to their surprise, Vili's mother cuts them off like, oh, Mrs. LeTourneau, that's his teacher. It's fine. Hand him back over. So with this assurance from Vili's mother, police let Mary and Vili go on their merry way, thinking end of story, right? Just a doting teacher and her student. No big deal. As they would find out along with everyone else, yes, it was absolutely a big deal. In March of 1997, less than 1 year later, Mary Kay LeTourneau would make international headlines when she was arrested for the rape of a child, the same boy police had caught her with that night, Vili Fualaau. But before we go any further, we are going to just back up a little bit and talk about who these two people were, what the crazy events were that led to them being found in that minivan by police that night, and all of the crazy events that occurred thereafter. And we're going to start with Mary, who was born Mary Catherine Schmitz in Tustin, California on the 30th of January 1962 to her parents John and Mary Schmitz. At the time of her birth, John, her father, was a college professor who taught philosophy and political science, focusing on anti-communism. And Mary's mother, also named Mary, had given up her promising career as a chemist to stay at home and manage the household and raise the couple's children. And because, as we've already established, there are two Marys here, we are going to call Mary, and Mary's mother, Mary Sr., just to eliminate any confusion. Now, Mary had 3 older brothers, but it was said that pretty much from the moment she was born, she was well and truly the apple of her father's eye, almost as though she was the child that he had been waiting for, and they were extremely close. John doted on Mary constantly. She pretty much worshipped the ground he walked on, and he just showered her in love and attention. But in stark comparison to this, Mary's mother, Mary Sr., was said to be very distant and reserved when it came to dealing with the children. So with these interesting family dynamics at play, it's very easy to see how Mary very quickly from the beginning became a daddy's girl. The Schmitz family themselves were ultra strict Roman Catholics and very, very conservative. Like, we're talking Mary and her brothers were actually moved from one school to another so that, God forbid, they would not have to be put through sex education classes, something that John and Mary Sr. were very opposed to. And when Mary was about 2 years old, her father John began to dabble in politics, and he was relatively successful. He started by running for a seat in state legislature, and with John being ultra conservative and his district being ultra conservative, it was a match made in heaven, and so he won that easily. In 1970, after the success, he went on to run for a seat in the US House of Representatives, and he won that too. So the Schmitz family moved to Washington, D.C. During this time, the family had continued to grow, and Mary went from being daddy's little girl to the middle child of 7 kids. And John, during his political career, during which, of course, he was right-wing, like extremely right-wing, actually, one of his political agendas was to wipe out all social services. But anyway, he held up his big, perfect family as kind of the standard for the American public to strive to. He was always talking about his family, be it in interviews, in social settings. Like, his family was a huge part of his image. In 1972, 1972, when Mary was 10 years old, her father became the presidential candidate for an extremely right-wing group, the American Independent Party. And while John ultimately lost this one, 1 million American people had voted for him, meaning he got about 1% of the popular vote. And considering how extreme he and his party were, like, this was a loss, but not a devastating one. And to Mary, her father was just this superstar. He was bigger than life. After this loss, the Schmitz family moved back to California, but this time to a very big fancy house complete with a pool in an exclusive area in Corona del Mar called Spyglass Hills. So they were definitely moving up in the world. But unfortunately, it wouldn't be long after this move that tragedy would strike for the first time in Mary's so far idyllic childhood. On the 11th of August 1973, the Schmitzes were hosting one of their many get-togethers with friends and political acquaintances, and that afternoon, Mary, who was 11 years old, had been tasked with looking after her 3-year-old baby brother, Philip, while they played in the pool and her parents mingled and strengthened their ties with potential political allies. But a couple of hours later, when the shindig was in full swing, Mary interrupted her mother to ask, "Where's Philip?" which of course started a totally panicked search for the baby boy, and the family found him unconscious at the bottom of the pool. Apparently, Philip had fallen into the deep end of the pool, while Mary had been distracted playing with one of her other brothers in the shallow end of the pool, and he had subsequently drowned. One of the police officers that attended the scene said he remembered Mary just saying over and over, "I only left him for a minute." Just a minute. Mary would say in later years that no one was blamed for Philip's death and it was just a horrible accident, which obviously it was. But some of her friends would come forward later and say that Mary always felt that her parents blamed her for Philip's death. And even if they didn't, even if it was just her imagination, she was just 11 years old and she had been told to look after her baby brother and then witnessed his death. So even though Philip's death obviously wasn't Mary's fault, I mean, it's human nature, and Mary was only 11 years old. There's no way to me that she didn't hold on to a huge amount of guilt from this incident. But like they say, time heals all wounds. Life moved on, Mary moved on, and she grew into a happy, well-adjusted teenager. She was a cheerleader at her all-girl Catholic high school. She didn't really get great grades, but her father, John's motto had always been "take the B." As in, don't work yourself to the bone and spend your life stressing about that A. Take the B. Chill out. Enjoy life. So that was definitely the attitude Mary seemed to take towards her school grades. Mary was also turning into a very attractive young woman, and I feel a bit blur even talking about Mary's appearance because usually in a case, someone's appearance isn't a big deal. So when people are like, "She was really pretty," I'm just sitting here feeling very uncomfortable. Like, why are you even talking about that? But in this instance, there's just no denying that Mary's appearance was a very big part of her personality and what made her her. And I'm sure it was a very touchy subject for her ultra-conservative parents, John and Mary Sr., because Mary was starting to show interest in boys and they were definitely starting to show interest in her. And while up until this point she had always been in Catholic schools, Mary was now talking about attending college at Arizona State University, something that her parents, John and Mary Sr., weren't all that thrilled about. Right, Lily? Right. You're pretty too. It's okay to talk about your appearance because you are beautiful and you know it. You are the least modest dog I know. No, you're very down to earth. Sorry. It was in 1978, though, when Mary was 15 years old and still in high school, that there was another massive bump in the road of life. And this time, it was thanks to her father. So it turned out that John Schmitz, outspoken knight in shining armor for traditional family morals and values that he was, had done the dirty on his wife, Mary Sr., with one of his former college students for 9 years. And he had 2 illegitimate children to show for it. Like, the guy had a whole second family. When all of this drama made headlines, of course, John's political career essentially ended then and there. He had committed the ultimate sin against literally everything that he stood for. John and Mary Sr. initially split up and sold their fancy house on Spyglass Hill. Mary Sr. packed up the youngest kids and moved back to Washington, D.C. to be with friends. And John, with his tail between his legs, moved into a trailer park to continue teaching at college and essentially just ride out the time until he could retire in disgrace. After a while, though, John and Mary Sr. reconciled and their marriage surprisingly survived. And Mary was devastated by the whole thing. Obviously, her incredible, untouchable, perfect father was now not even remotely perfect. And yet she still took his side, like to the extreme. To friends, she said that her mother had driven her father into the affair by being cold and distant and not giving him the affection that he needed and deserved as a husband. Putting all of this drama behind her, Mary went on with her plan to attend Arizona State University, where she really seemed to rebel against her strict upbringing and finally had the chance to live life outside of her parents' shadow. So she was out partying, drinking, meeting boys, all stuff that was really very normal for a girl her age to do. But because of the way she was raised, I'm sure it all felt very risque and taboo, and she really seemed to revel in this. And it was during all of this partying it up that Mary met a boy named Steve LeTourneau, and Mary and Steve had a little bit of fun, and it wasn't much later that Mary found out she was pregnant with Steve's baby in 1984. But John and Mary Sr. kicked themselves then for not letting Mary take sex education. Just saying. And Mary hadn't had the chance to tell anyone yet. She was still in the process of freaking out when she wound up in hospital in the middle of having a miscarriage. But when Mary called her mother from the hospital, Mary Sr. spoke with the medical staff treating her, who wanted to complete a D&C, just a standard medical procedure to make sure that there are no complications that arise after a miscarriage. And she told them not to do it. Her reasoning was that Mary could be pregnant with more than one baby, and if that was the case, a D&C could kill a perfectly healthy baby that hadn't been miscarried. And these medical staff were probably like, so you want to risk your daughter's health on the very slim possibility that this was a multiple pregnancy. But as it turned out, this hunch of Mary Sr.'s was on point, and Mary was pregnant with twins, and only one of them had miscarried. Crazy. So after this miscarriage, the still pregnant Mary reached out to her parents, asking them for advice on what she should do. And I don't know why she even bothered, because it should be no surprise that they pressured her, almost gave her no other choice but to marry Steve, the baby's father. And Steve was fun, and he and Mary had a strong physical connection, but he was not someone that Mary would ever consider getting into a long-term relationship with, let alone getting married and starting a family with. But she complied with her parents' wishes, and she and Steve got hitched on the 30th of June 1984 in a traditional Catholic ceremony. Well, as traditional as it could be, seeing as the bride was 4 months pregnant and everyone knew. Like, there was that. After the wedding, Mary and Steve dropped out of college, and their youngest son, Steve Jr., was born in October of that year. The family of three then moved to Steve's hometown, Anchorage, Alaska, where Steve got a job as a baggage handler for Alaska Airlines, working very long double shifts. But all of these hours that Steve worked could not keep the family out of financial strife, something that they fought constantly over. Mary would quite often call her parents begging them for money, but they seemed either quite unwilling or unable to help. So Mary instead had to be satisfied with keeping up appearances, making sure that she and Steve Jr. were dressed in semi-decent, neat clothes, when in reality, the bills were piling up and their phone line had been cut off. Mary and Steve's second child, Mary Claire, was born in 85 or 86, around which point the family then moved back to Seattle when Steve was transferred for work. And over the next few years, Mary and Steve went on to have 2 more children. All of this time, things between Mary and Steve were not going well. at all. One of the contributing factors was that Steve was not a fan of the way Mary kept the house, because while during the day she was caring for and raising their 4 children, at night she was attending night classes at Seattle University to get her degree in teaching. So Mary didn't exactly have the time to keep the house spick and span. Steve was also tiptoeing around outside the marriage, taking part in extramarital activities with multiple different ladies, and it's said that Mary, completely aware of Steve's infidelities, was feeling very emotionally neglected and was unfaithful as well. And when they were together, they were just fighting about money, about how the house should be run. It was just not a happy environment at all. It just sounds horrendous. And it was this way for years. And then in 1989, Mary finished up her studies and got her degree in teaching. And she started teaching second grade at Shorewood Elementary School in Seattle. And Mary quickly became a very well-liked teacher amongst the students and her colleagues and superiors. It was like this was what Mary had always been meant to do. She had officially found her calling. Mary was soft-spoken, she was nice, she was pretty, she had a knack with connecting with these kids. She said from her very first day teaching second grade, she would give all the kids in the class a choice of either H, H, or H, a high five, a handshake, or a hug, to make sure that she connected with each student personally. In 1995, after working at Shorewood for 6 years, Mary got a promotion where she would move from teaching second grade to both 5th and 6th grades. And with this reputation she had built as this super cool, nice teacher, you better believe that all of these 5th and 6th graders were clamoring over each other to get into Mrs. LeTourneau's class. When the school year began, one of these kids that was lucky enough to get into Mary's class was 6th grader Vili Fualaau. And Vili at this point was 12 years old, but Mary recognized him from when she had taught him 4 years earlier in second grade. And so Mary had met Vili when he was just 7 years old. Just a little tidbit for you guys to remember and think about later. Vili Fualaau was born in Honolulu, Hawaii on the 26th of June, 1983 to his parents, Lueva and Suna Fualaau. And not to be rude here, but I am being very generous calling Vili's father a parent. This was a man that would brag about having fathered 18 children to 5 different women, none of which he managed to really be present for because he was in prison for armed robbery. So just a real swell guy. Vili was the youngest of 4 boys, and when he was 4 years old, his family relocated from Honolulu to what was considered at the time a very poverty-stricken area just outside of Seattle called Des Moines. Is it lily break time again? Oh, you want to do it again? Okay, come on, Paul, show him. Oh, you're so clever. You're so clever. Yeah, they know. It's okay. They know. They know how clever you are. Yes. She just wanted to remind you guys, she's very clever. Vili's mother, Suna, who was pretty much a single mother to these 4 boys, worked long hours at multiple jobs, including a bakery, quite often at night, struggling to support the family because Lord knows she wasn't getting any help from Lueva. So she, as a result, probably wasn't able to be present at home as much as she would have liked to. Vili had an avid interest and talent in art, something Mary had noticed back when she taught him in second grade. And as she quite often did with students she felt were particularly gifted, she had given Vili extra time and attention. So now that he was in her class again at 12 years old, this was something she continued, encouraging him to develop his creative skills. And I know just from saying that you guys are all like, I see where this is headed, because we all know where this leads. But I'm sure at the beginning it all felt very natural and innocent to Mary and Vili, just an attentive teacher helping her talented student. But over the course of the next school year, these innocent beginnings would take a very disturbing change of course. It seems like Vili developed a crush on Mary from very early on, and it's very easy to see how this could have happened. I mean, like we've discussed, Vili wasn't getting a lot of attention from anyone at home, and then all of a sudden, he had this very pretty teacher giving him all of this extra attention. Apparently, he made a bet with one of his friends, a $20 bet, that he could sleep with the teach. And Mary, meanwhile, she's stuck in in this marriage that she never wanted to be in the first place with a man she doesn't love that just cannot, for the love of God, stay faithful to her. And then at school, she's got this sweet, talented student who looks at her with just complete adoration, as though she's the most beautiful woman that he's ever seen in his life. And so it starts with Vili staying late after class and Mary's buying him dinner. And then she's buying him art supplies that he can't afford. And then they're even hanging out alone in Mary's car on breaks. And it continues on this track for a while. Mary and Vili just gradually spending more and more time together. And towards the end of the school year in 1996, people do start to notice. Some of Mary's colleagues even comment saying that sometimes it seems like her and Vili are two teenagers flirting with each other. But Mary just shrugs this off, right? And come summer, when usually you would expect them to split ways, Mary and Vili spend more time together and they go to art classes together at a community college. Mary even convinces her husband Steve to let Vili come on a family vacation to Alaska. And Vili and one of his brothers are quite often at Mary's house, just chilling out, hanging out with Mary's oldest son, Steve Jr., who it's worth noting was only 1 year younger than Vili. It was around this time that Mary's father, John Schmitz, was diagnosed with prostate cancer, and it was believed that he only had a short time to live. So Mary was obviously devastated, and apparently her husband, Steve, just couldn't give her the emotional support that she needed during this difficult time. And so this seemed to just push Mary even closer to Vili. And so it was one night in the summer of 1996 at Mary's house while Steve was working his long hours as a baggage handler and Mary's kids, her 4 kids, were upstairs asleep in their beds, that this close bond between teacher and student became physical. At this time, Mary was 34 years old and Vili was just days away from his 13th birthday. And Mary says it started with a kiss and that's where she expected it to end, but it just didn't. When talking about this event later, Mary would make it sound kind of like the whole thing was out of her hands. And when talking about Vili later, she would say, and I quote, "He dominated me in the most masculine way that any man, any leader could do. I trusted him and believed in him and our future." It wasn't long after this night that the incident occurred that we spoke about at the beginning of this video, where Mary and Vili were caught in the minivan in the car park. But apparently this brush with the law did not spook Mary into ending things with Vili. Instead, a couple of months later, in October 1996, Mary called her best friend and she was very excited because she was pregnant. Mary had called this friend a few weeks earlier and told her that she was in love with someone other than her husband. And she had said that this person, obviously Vili, was the person she had been looking for her entire life and that he was her soulmate. So apparently this encounter with the police, rather than scaring Mary into ending things with Vili, it had instead scared her into doing something drastic to make sure that they would be together forever. You know, something like having a baby. Because as it would come out later, this pregnancy was totally planned and agreed upon by the 34-year-old Mary and the 13-year-old Vili. According to Mary, when she found out she was pregnant, she lured her husband, Steve, to have sex with her so that he would think that the baby was his. But she knew this deception couldn't last because when the baby was born, it was most likely going to have dark hair and dark skin like Vili. But luckily, she had like 9 months to work something out, right? But yeah, no, because Steve, just like Mary's colleagues at Shorewood Elementary School, had noticed how much time she and Vili were spending together. And so when she told him that she was pregnant, his instant suspicion was that it was Vili's. So he went on this big search of the house, ransacking everything, and he ended up finding evidence to confirm his suspicions in the form of love letters that Mary had written to Vili. So Steve was justifiably livid. He confronted Vili, telling him to stay the heck away from Mary, and he was shouting at Mary, saying that she needed to end whatever the F this was that she had going on with Vili, and that she needed to get an abortion immediately. Even Mary's mother, Mary Sr., who we know was very pro-life, told Mary the same thing when she found out about everything. But like we've already established, Mary was very excited about this pregnancy. And as far as she was concerned, the only thing she had done wrong was not to have sex with her 13-year-old student and get pregnant by him. No, it was to have extramarital sex outside of her marriage with Steve. She felt really bad about that. And so Mary seemed to be living in this fantasy land where she could fix this little stuff up by getting divorced from Steve, and Steve was going to move out. And Vili, who had pretty much been living at the house anyway, all the hours that Steve had been working as a baggage handler. Yeah, so he was going to officially move in and they would raise this baby together. But Steve is ruining everything, being like, Mary, no, we are not going to get divorced. I am not going to put our children, our 4 other children, through all of that. So Mary and Steve are in this really awkward standoff, right? Mary is thinking that Steve will agree to the divorce and move on out so that her and Vili can get on with their new life together. And Steve is thinking that Mary will eventually snap out of it and come to her senses and end things with Vili for good. And this standoff lasts for months, during which time Mary's pregnancy is obviously progressing. And when at Shorewood Elementary School, people are starting to notice when she's forced to acknowledge the pregnancy, Mary will only say that the baby is hers, not Steve's. Steve, meanwhile, had confided everything to his family about Mary and Vili, and they had agreed to keep quiet until it was decided what was going to happen. But in February of 1997, this silence was broken when Steve's cousin made an anonymous call to both Child Protective Services and the Highline School District to report Mary for having sex with her 13-year-old student. And this report was then forwarded on to the police. So Vili was then questioned by a detective about his and Mary's relationship, and he confirmed reluctantly that yes, it was sexual, but he severely downplayed the amount of times they had had sex because he was scared of sending her away to prison for life. And that very same day, on the 4th of March 1997, a heavily pregnant Mary Kay LeTourneau was called out of a teacher meeting to be arrested for statutory rape. But seeing as Mary was 6 months pregnant at the time, it was decided that her day in court would be delayed until after she had given birth. So Mary was released on bail, and when she got home, she came home to an empty house. Steve had moved in with friends, and her 4 children had been sent to live with relatives. So Mary, of course, despite being instructed very firmly to have no contact with children, including her own, but especially Vili, made the totally logical and unsurprising decision to have Vili move in with her. And considering she had been suspended from teaching, the 2 of them had a few months here to just chill out and wait for their baby to arrive. On the 29th of May 1997, Mary gave birth to her 5th child, a beautiful, healthy baby girl named Audrey Lokalani Fualaau. And so for this little tiny snapshot of time, the little family of 3 were in this bubble where the world just faded out around them, and they were just a normal, everyday, happy family. But this bubble well and truly crashed down around them a couple of months later in August, when Mary's date with justice rolled around and she was due to appear in court. And the media attention surrounding this case by this point had reached full-on frenzy mode. I know these days you do see like a disturbing amount of cases similar to this pop up here and there, not necessarily because they happen more often, but probably because the crime actually gets reported. But back when it was Mary and Vili, the idea of a female sexual predator was essentially unheard of. So the media just went absolutely wild with this case, and their coverage was just beyond problematic, but we're going to put a bookmark in that for now and get on with the story. So the prosecution were pushing for a 6.5-year jail sentence for Mary, and her attorney told her that the only way to avoid this jail time was to plead guilty to 2 counts of second-degree child rape and to request to be placed into a state-funded treatment program for sex offenders. Mary was really hesitant to agree to this because, like we said, as far as she was concerned, the only thing she had done wrong was to cheat on her husband. And Mary would go on to say that while she knew that her relationship with Vili was unusual, she had no idea that having sex with a 13-year-old was a felony that could place her in prison. But faced with all those years behind bars where she would be separated from her children, it was an easy decision that she eventually agreed to, and also gave this tearful address to the judge.
I did something that I had no right to do, morally or legally. It was wrong, and I am sorry. I give you my word that it will not happen again. Please, please help me. Help us all.
Leading up to this, Mary had been assessed by multiple psychiatrists, and at least one of them had said that this whole debacle had been caused by trauma that Mary herself had experienced in her past and childhood. And she had also been diagnosed with bipolar disorder and been placed on medication. And so the judge, Judge Linda Lau, clearly took a whole bunch of pity on Mary and accepted the plea deal and gave her the extremely lenient sentence of just 6 months jail time, 3 of which were suspended. There were a couple of conditions attached to this plea deal, of course. Firstly, Mary would have to give up custody of baby Audrey to Vili's mother sooner. When she was released, she would have to register as a sex offender and take part in a treatment program for sex offenders. And during this time, a minimum of 6 months, she would be allowed no contact with children whatsoever, including her own. And finally, she was to have no contact whatsoever ever again with Vili Fualaau. Mary, of course, agreed to all of these conditions, and after serving just 3 months in jail, she was released from prison in January 1998. But just a couple of weeks after this, on the 3rd of February, there was a tiny little incident of deja vu where police on a routine neighborhood patrol came across a parked car at about 3 a.m., just about a block from Mary's house. And as soon as the window rolled down, police of course recognized the 2 people inside. It was Mary Kay LeTourneau and Vili Fualaau. Vili, by this point in time, was 15 years old and sharing the task of caring for his and Mary's infant daughter, Audrey, with his mother, Suna. And Mary originally gave false names for her and Vili and pulled her line again about how he was a family friend that had just been scared off by an argument she had had with her husband. But police were like, no, you are very clearly Mary Kay LeTourneau. We know who you are. And things got even worse when they searched the car because they found things like baby clothes and formula, even though Mary was supposed to have no contact with baby Audrey whatsoever. Also men's clothes that looked like they had been purchased for Vili. And also $6,200 cash and Mary's passport, suggesting that her and Vili had been planning on fleeing the country. And so Mary was obviously instantly arrested, and 3 days later she was back in court in front of Judge Lau, who had taken it oh so easy on Mary originally, but now she was freaking pissed and she came down like a ton of bricks.
These violations are extraordinarily egregious and profoundly disturbing. This case is not about a flawed system. It is about an opportunity that you foolishly squandered.
Judge Lau immediately vacated the plea deal and gave Mary the maximum sentence she had available to her, which was 7.5 years jail time. And in a normal case, with the perpetrator being sent back to prison for the second time, you would think we would be winding things up right about now. But if you check out that progress bar just below me, you'll see that we're not even close to done because this case just got crazier, because it didn't take long for prison officials to realize that Mary, who, may I remind you, had been out of prison for a matter of weeks, was pregnant once again with her and Vili's second child. And this was something that it seems like Vili found out only when Mary's attorney announced it to the rest of the world publicly. Like, he found out with everyone else. And so on the 16th of October 1998, Mary gave birth to another beautiful, healthy baby girl and named her Georgia Alexis Fualaau. And just a couple of hours later, Georgia was taken from Mary and placed into the custody of Vili's mother, Suna, with her sister, Audrey. Meanwhile, at the time of Georgia's birth, Vili was in Paris promoting a book that he and Mary had written about their romance called The Only Crime, Love. So gross. This book would only end up being published in France because Mary argued that some of the quotes in it were inaccurate. And so she fought super hard to make sure that it was never published in the States. But this brings us back to the questionable media coverage of this case that we bookmarked earlier, because while that book never made it outside of France, it didn't stop the relationship between Mary and Vili, if you could ever call it that, being painted as a love story by the magazines and tabloids and TV specials around the world. And in this love story being pushed by the media, Mary wasn't a predator at all. She and Vili were, in fact, star-crossed lovers caught out in this tryst that you and me regular folk would just never understand. Vili's identity, which had been kept secret from the public up until this point, was only revealed a couple of months before the book was released in France, when he accepted a $50,000 offer from a tabloid newspaper called The Globe for a tell-all interview about his affair with his teacher, because apparently this sexual relationship between a 34-year-old teacher and her 13-year-old student could be classified as an affair. And while all that was going on, Mary, meanwhile, having pled guilty and literally currently incarcerated for child rape at the time, made the cover of People magazine with the infant that she shared with her victim, straight up looking like she was the victim in the whole scenario, being persecuted against by a society in which there was no room for the love she shared with Vili. And that was just the media. Comparatively, the general public's opinion on the way this case had been handled by the judicial system was very, very divided. It was, of course, pointed out by countless different people that had the genders been reversed here and it was a 34-year-old male teacher having sex with his 13-year-old female student, and upon being caught, he'd been sentenced to just 3 months jail time, and then upon reoffending had just received 7.5 years jail time, the backlash would have been unfathomable. But on the other hand, because the genders were what they were, there were people that legit did not see the big deal here. Vili was living the actual dream, shacking up with his extremely attractive teacher. He should be getting high fives and considering himself lucky. But in reality, Vili, at just 15 years old, was now the father to not one, but 2 baby girls. And with Mary in prison, he was essentially on his own. Like, he had help from his mother Suna, but his childhood, his adolescence, had essentially come to a screeching halt. And he didn't really have anyone to talk to either, because all of his friends were out partying and meeting girls and going to school and getting an education, whereas Vili had had to drop out of school so that he could do things like heat up formula and change diapers and just be a dad. I'm not sure how much support he got from his mother during all of this, because if Suna was already having to work a ton of hours to make things work when it was just Vili and his brothers, I imagine she had to pick up even more work when she took in her 2 granddaughters. And on top of this, rather than getting the support and compassion he would have received if the genders had been reversed, Vili was getting high fives and pats on the back Apparently, the school gave him counseling, but it sounds like this was a very half-hearted effort on their part. In 2002, Vili and his mother Suna sued the Des Moines Police Department. Remember, the ones that had released Vili back into Mary's custody after they caught them in the minivan? After Suna gave the go-ahead, but she said that this was something she never would have done if the police department had told her that Mary had lied about Vili's age and what had happened in the car. And they also sued the Highline School District, saying that both of these organizations had failed to protect Vili from Mary. And they were seeking somewhere between $1 and $2 million in damages for emotional suffering, lost wages, and the cost of raising Vili's 2 young daughters. Now, Suna had said previously that her son, Vili, wasn't the victim that the media portrayed him as, and that the case never should have been prosecuted in the first place. But she now said that as a direct result of Mary's abuse, Vili had suffered multiple bouts of alcoholism and suicidal depression. Vili and Suna ultimately lost this lawsuit, and Vili went on to have a couple of brushes with the law during the time that Mary was incarcerated. At one point, he pled guilty to auto theft and got probation and a fine instead of jail time. But essentially, this time that Mary was in jail was a very dark period in Vili's life. Like he said in an interview later that he was surprised he was even still alive. But on the 4th of August 2004, Mary, who was now 41 years old, was released from prison. And she and Vili had managed to stay in contact all of this time, despite that no contact order, mostly through letters that Mary had snuck out of prison and phone calls that she had had other inmates make on her behalf. And somehow, despite the odds, Mary and Vili's love had survived, and the two of them had plans to get married in the immediate future. In fact, just a couple of weeks before Mary was released, Vili had sent their 2 daughters, Audrey and Georgia, in to visit their mother in prison, singing a traditional Samoan engagement song as a way of proposing. The only thing standing between them now, of course, was that pesky no contact order, something that Vili applied to have reversed on the day that Mary was released. And seeing as Vili was now a fully grown adult at 21 years old, and that the no contact would make it a little bit awkward for him and Mary to raise their 2 daughters, the courts grudgingly agreed and lifted the order. Not long after her release, Mary sat down for an interview with Barbara Walters, and the only positive thing you will ever hear me say about Mary ever is that in this interview, she is giving off total mid-90s / early 2000s Mariah Carey vibes, and I hate myself, but I'm living for it. And Barbara has the most iconic expressions during this interview. Like, I'm almost living for those more than Mary's Mariah Carey vibes. Mariah Carey vibes aside, these are some of the things that Mary had to say for herself.
How long after you got out of prison were you in contact with Vili?
Oh,
A day? A week?
not too many hours after the no contact
many
order
hours.
was lifted.
Did he call you or did you call him?
I waited for him to call me.
You are now how old?
I'm 42.
Vili is 21.
Mm-hmm.
Does this age difference bother you at all?
I'm sure we both wish that we were closer in age so that we would, with more certainty, know that we would have the longest time possible together with each other.
Do you plan to marry Vili?
We've always planned that, and it hasn't changed.
Would you like to have more children with Vili?
Well, I'm healthy enough.
I have to ask you this, Mary, because I don't want to read about it in another tabloid. Are you pregnant now?
Oh, no.
Mary, was it worth it?
I remember as the elevator closed, right after I was sentenced to serve out the 7.5 years, there was a reporter as the elevator was closing. She said, "Mary wasn't worth it." Mary wasn't worth it, and the doors closed on it. And here's that question again. Mm-hmm.
Can you answer it?
I don't look at life that way. I do my best. So if you asked me that question, did you do your best through every situation? I can say I did my best. I did. I did do my best.
When asked about her plans for the future, Mary said, of course, she planned to marry Vili. And she also said she planned to get back into teaching because apparently, despite now being a registered sex offender, Mary would be permitted to teach in private schools and community colleges, if any of them would hire her, of course. The following year, on the 20th of May 2005, Mary and Vili got married in a very fancy, elaborate ceremony in a winery in Seattle. And the media just, of course, ate this up. There were satellite trucks and camera crews lined up down the road outside the venue, even helicopters flying overhead. But Mary and Vili had sold the rights to their wedding for $750,000, which is over $1 million by today's standards, to Entertainment Tonight. So clearly to the media, even now after everything, Mary and Vili was still a very golden, marketable couple. At the wedding, Mary was given away by her brother as her father, John Schmitz, had passed away 3 years earlier in 2001 from cancer while she was still in prison. Mary's daughter from her first marriage was her maid of honor. One of her bridesmaids was a woman she had met in prison, and her 2 daughters with Vili, Audrey, now 8, and Georgia, now 7, were her flower girls. As Mary wasn't allowed to leave the state because she was still on probation, she and Vili weren't able to go on a fancy honeymoon or anything after getting married. So they instead used the money from selling the rights to their wedding to start their new private adult life together on a waterfront property in Seattle. But this life definitely wasn't perfect by any means. A year later, in 2006, Vili was arrested and convicted for drunk driving, and Mary's kids from her original marriage, her 4 children, they initially made a big effort to reconnect with their mother and her new husband. It just seemed like this was too big of a feat for all those involved and just too strange for comfort. Like, Vili was only 1 year older than Mary's oldest son, Steve, and suddenly he was their stepfather and telling them to clean up after themselves and all of that. Like, it felt weird for Vili. It felt weird for the kids. And so it seems like Mary and her 4 eldest children ended up in quite a strained, distant relationship. So as we spoke about earlier, Vili had to drop out of school to raise his 2 daughters, Audrey and Georgia. And so as a result, he had never really had the chance to develop his artistic skills that had drawn Mary to him in the first place and make a profession out of them. But over the years, what Vili had gotten an interest and talent in was music and DJing. And so during the day, I think it was Home Depot that he was working at. And then at night, he was DJing under the name DJ Headline. And it was in 2009 that Mary and Vili and an owner of a bar in Seattle thought that it would be a good idea to have a weekly ongoing event called Hot for Teacher. And I'm already cringing and feeling so uncomfortable because at these events, which were so obviously cashing in on the controversial relationship that had gotten them so famous in the first place, Vili would be DJing and Mary would be hosting and greeting the bar patrons as they walked in. At some of the other venues that they would host these events, Mary would also even get up and dance for the crowd while dressed as the character Max from the children's book Where the Wild Things Are. And I know that this was just a way for them to make money to get by, I guess, but it all just feels wildly inappropriate to me that a registered sex offender who had served like 8 years in prison for raping her student was now dressing up as a character from a children's book and dancing for the entertainment of others. Like, is that just me? Am I completely insane, or was that just so gross? Mary never ended up getting back into teaching, something I don't think came as a huge surprise to anyone, and she instead became a paralegal working in the same courthouse that she had gone to trial in all those years before. And she and Vili would go on over the years to do multiple media appearances, including another special with Barbara Walters in 2015 for their 10-year wedding anniversary. And considering how they had begun, watching this special, everything in Mary and Vili's life just appeared very normal. They were a normal couple doing normal things. Their two daughters, Audrey and Georgia, appeared in the special, now teenagers, and very clearly well-adjusted, happy young girls. Everything seemed peachy. But just a couple of years later in 2017, news broke that Vili had applied for separation from Mary, and he initially said that it wasn't as it seemed. There was no love lost between him and Mary or anything. It was just that he had wanted to start a marijuana business and Mary's status as a sex offender was getting in the way. However, in August 2019, after a bit of back and forth, Mary and Vili finalized their legal separation and went their separate ways. But just when everyone was thinking it was over, it turned out that this love story still wasn't finished, because not long after their split, Mary found out that she had colorectal cancer, and by the time it was caught, it had already spread to her liver. So she reached out to Vili, and he instantly got on a plane to be by her side. And he said that while Mary initially seemed okay and seemed to be under the impression that the whole thing would blow over, within 6 months, Mary's health had seriously deteriorated. And last year, on the 6th of July, 2020, Mary passed away from complications from her cancer. With her in her final moments were Vili, of course, their two daughters, Audrey and Georgia, and her youngest daughter from her previous marriage with Steve LeTourneau. A couple of months later, Vili said in an interview with Dr. Oz that the very last thing Mary had ever said to him was that he was the most important person to her and that everything was going to be okay. And that brings us to the end of the crazy tale of Mary Kay LeTourneau and Vili Fualaau. What a freaking roller coaster, am I right? But now that we are all experts in the case, let's wind this baby up with final thoughts. I am sorry if this disappoints, but this installment of final thoughts is going to be a relatively short one because it turns out that as the mother of a young boy, I just cannot voice my opinions on this case without it turning into this big, massive, angry rant about Mary Kay LeTourneau. Like I've tried several times and I can't. It's just insta rant. So if you have felt during this video that I have been going particularly light on Mary and have been restraining myself, then you are not crazy. You are so right. And it's not because I feel like this is something Mary particularly deserves personally. It's more so because I made an executive decision to be respectful to those still around and involved in the case, like Vili, Audrey and Georgia, and also Mary's children from her first marriage. Vili, bless his goddamn soul, I cannot speak highly enough of him. Like, he has been so careful and so respectful all of these years in every little thing he has ever said about Mary. Watching interviews he's given, I was just in a constant state of awe at his composure and his diplomacy. I feel like his maturity level seriously overtook Mary's a good many years ago. One thing I would notice when watching Mary in interviews was that she always managed to make the whole thing sound like this whirlwind and that it all happened so suddenly, even though we know that she was Vili's teacher for a whole year, during which time she and Vili just got closer and closer before any contact ever occurred. And so to me, in actuality, what occurred over the course of this year was that Mary twisted reality so much so that in her mind and in Vili's, the abuse was justified because she managed to cast Vili, 13-year-old Vili, as the instigator in the situation. And this was the narrative that Mary maintained for the rest of her life. Like, I truly believe that Mary went to the grave believing that she had never been the abuser and that Vili had never been the victim. Quite clearly evidenced by a couple of awkward moments right here in one of the last interviews that she and Vili ever gave while she was still alive.
Your children, Mary. It must have been unimaginably tough on them.
That's why I asked him to go get away from us. Go and do your thing.
But that's
I said,
making
"Go
it
and
seem
do
like
your
Vili
thing."
was relentlessly pursuing you. You were the adult.
You can say that.
I am saying that.
I was by age.
And
Let's
by
just say
maturity.
that. You maybe.
You were a teacher, Mary. You
Doesn't
can't say I
matter.
was immature.
But you don't know him.
No, but I don't need to know him in this discussion. He's the child.
Who was
I'm
the
talking
boss?
about you.
Who was the boss?
What was his name?
Who was the boss?
What?
Who was the boss back
You know,
then?
there was me pursuing you, but
Who was the boss back then?
this is ridiculous.
No,
This
who
is
was?
ridiculous.
Who was? Just say.
Just say.
Who was the boss?
All I knew was what I knew back then.
But who was the boss?
He was 13, Mary.
But who was the boss?
This is getting weird.
Who was the boss? Who?
I'm pursuing the relationship.
Who was the boss?
Well, I was the pursuer.
Yes.
Mary, even as you're
But-
hearing this now, come on, he was 13.
Doesn't matter.
It absolutely matters.
And I think that is where I'm going to leave this one today, guys. There is obviously, I feel like you can tell there's so much more I could say about this case, but it just turns into this long rant and I get really angry and heated and upset. And it's not fun for anyone. Instead of ranting, I would like to say a huge thank you if you have made it this far through this video. I know there's like a million different other videos you could have watched in this time, and the fact that you voluntarily chose to hang out with me all this time just means the absolute world. Like, it makes me question your sanity a little bit, but it means the world. Thank you so much. And as usual, I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on this case. Our hangout does not have to end here. We can just move the party down to the comments down below and you can tell me all about how you feel about this case. Does it make you as angry as it does me? Do you think Mary Kay was maybe delusional, or do you think it was all very intentional on her part? I would love to hear what you guys think, and let's just all give each other emotional support on this one. Lily has come to say bye without even being prompted. She is such a pro now. Yeah, they're there. They're there. I bet there's some doggies there too. Thank you so much for hanging out with me and Lily today. It makes us so happy. If you enjoyed this video, remember to let me know by giving it a like down below. And we hope you have the best week of all time. And we will be counting down the hours until we see you in the next one. Bye. That wasn't as dramatic as I hoped.
I've been there, but I have to stay afloat. It's not easy, be a person you